Okay, so previously we covered photosynthesis, the equation for photosynthesis, the chemical equation for the photosynthesis, the balanced equation for photosynthesis. Further, we discussed about the particular organelle that was involved in photosynthesis, which is the chloroplast, and how and which raw materials are needed for photosynthesis, what are the waste products being produced in the photosynthesis. And today, what we're going to be discussing that would be factors affecting photosynthesis. And there's various factors that usually determine how much photosynthesis takes place, whether it's happening at a higher rate or at a lower rate, because every plant has its, let's say, own capability to carry out photosynthesis. Some factors in the environment, some stimuli, some agents in the environment can affect the rate of photosynthesis. For example, like lower the raw materials, lesser the raw materials, the rate of photosynthesis would be low, of course, because photosynthesis needs raw materials. And those raw materials include carbon dioxide. If the carbon dioxide is low inside the environment, of course, the raw material would be in a lesser quantity, and photosynthesis will take place at a lower rate. So we're going to be discussing in detail what are the factors affecting the photosynthesis. So basically, limiting factors. Plants do not have unlimited supplies of their raw materials, so their rate of photosynthesis is limited by whatever factor is the lowest at that time. All right, so there are basically many factors that affect rate of photosynthesis, but whichever factor is the lowest is the one affecting the rate of photosynthesis at that particular time. Moreover, so a limiting factor can be defined as something present in the environment in such short supply that it restricts life process. For example, carbon dioxide concentration, if it is in a short supply, it would restrict the life process of a plant. What is the life process of a plant? It's photosynthesis. Of course, when there's low amount of carbon dioxide, it would affect the life process of a living organism. And the life process, one of them we studied in Mrs. Grant, the classification of living organism, which is called nutrition. In order to obtain nutrition, plants need to carry out photosynthesis. Hence, limiting factors, if present in a short supply, can restrict the nutrition life process, which is the rate of photosynthesis. Temperature, diet intensity, and carbon dioxide concentration are the three limiting factors in your syllabus, because photosynthesis is actually dependent on temperature, light intensity, and carbon dioxide. Because the photosynthesis is the independent variable, no, is a dependent variable, the rate of photosynthesis, affected by number one, temperature, number two, light intensity, and number three, carbon dioxide concentration. Of course, when these change, and the rate of photosynthesis would be affected by this. Higher temperature would affect the rate of photosynthesis in a different way than a lower light intensity or a higher carbon dioxide concentration. Although water is necessary for photosynthesis, it is not considered a limiting factor, as the amount needed is relatively small compared to the amount of water transpired from a plant. So there is hardly ever a situation where there is not enough water for photosynthesis. Now we all know that water is needed for photosynthesis. Water is a raw material for photosynthesis, but it is not a limiting factor. Why? Because plants use a little amount of water, and they're also constantly transpiring the water out of the plant, and they still have some water stored inside them as well. Hence, if the quantity of water or the amount of water, is it, if it's large or short, if it's more or less inside the environment, it won't affect the rate of photosynthesis, because the plant has some water stored already, and it's also diffusing it out through transpiration as well. So the only limiting factors are the factors, for example, we studied the factors affecting diffusion. What were they? They were the temperature, concentration gradient, surface area affecting the rate of diffusion. Similar is the case when we talk about rate of photosynthesis. Light energy, carbon dioxide concentration, and uh, what was the other one? Temperature affect the rate of photosynthesis. The number of chloroplasts or the amount of chlorophyll in the chloroplast can also affect the rate of photosynthesis. How? Because chlorophyll, as we all know, is the green pigment present in leaves, which actually is responsible for trapping the light energy. If the amount of chlorophyll in the leaves is less, the rate of photosynthesis would also be low. If the amount of chlorophyll is more inside the leaves, in bright green leaves, of course, would trap more light energy, more photosynthesis, higher rate of photosynthesis. Hence, the amount of chlorophyll and the number of chloroplasts. Number of chloroplasts, if the number of chloroplasts are less, the rate of photosynthesis would be lower. If the number of chloroplasts is high, the higher the rate of photosynthesis. Same is the case with chlorophyll and chloroplast. They're both lesser chlorophyll and chloroplast, lesser the rate of photosynthesis. More chloroplast and chlorophyll, more rate of photosynthesis. So we have three graphs over here. We have the first graph of light intensity, the second one is for CO2 concentration, and the third one is telling us about temperature. Now, how are these factors affecting photosynthesis and how are these graphs actually varying? We'll be discussing it. For example, we've discussed the shape of graphs and many other chapters also. For example, the light intensity increases at a point when the rate of photosynthesis becomes constant. Same is the case when the plant has absorbed maximum concentration of carbon dioxide, it reaches a point where it doesn't need any more. Same is the case is the rate of photosynthesis increases at a certain temperature, let's say 50. Beyond that, the rate of photosynthesis would start to decrease again. This is a similar graph when we discussed about enzymes and the denaturation of enzyme whenever there was a higher temperature and then the temperature crossed the point where there was the optimum temperature of the enzyme, the rate of photosynthesis, the enzymatic action was affected and the graph sloped down. Same is the case with temperature and rate of photosynthesis. Temperature at one point helps the rate of photosynthesis to reach up to maximum, but at one point, when the temperature becomes higher than, for example, 50, it may be different for all plants, the rate of photosynthesis almost comes back to zero. Let's discuss about the first factor, which is temperature in detail. The temperature of the environment affects how much kinetic energy all the particles have. Whenever you hear about temperature, we always discussed about kinetic energy because if you remember in the previous chapter, we were discussing about diffusion and temperature. And main phenomenon being used over there was about the kinetic energy of the particles. Higher the temperature, higher the kinetic energy gained by the particles. They move faster, they collide, and they diffused faster. So the temperature affects the speed at which carbon dioxide and water move through the plant. Of course, for photosynthesis, plants need carbon dioxide and it also needs water. Now, when we increase the temperature, the kinetic energy of the CO2 molecules will increase and they will diffuse inside the plant faster. So is the case when I increase the temperature over here, the water molecules would gain more kinetic energy and or diffuse through osmosis inside the plant faster. Hence, higher the temperature, higher the carbon dioxide and water diffuses inside the plant. So the temperature affects the speed at which carbon dioxide and water move through a plant. The lower the temperature, the less kinetic energy particles have, resulting in fewer successful collisions occurring over a period of time. Increasing temperature increases the kinetic energy of the particles as we discussed. Temperature increases, kinetic energy of the particles increases, number of collisions increases between the reactants and enzyme, which results in the formation of products. Of course, higher the temperature, the reactants would interact faster and would result in products such as glucose and oxygen. At higher temperatures, however, enzymes that control the processes of photosynthesis can be denatured, where the active site changes shape and is no longer complementary. Now, of course, there are some enzymes involved in photosynthesis, and at higher temperature, we studied in biological molecules that at higher temperature, enzymes denature. How do they denature? Their active site changes shape and is no longer complementary to its substrate. This reduces the overall rate of photosynthesis, which means lower the no, higher the temperature, lower the enzymes, lower the rate of photosynthesis. So this is how you're supposed to link all the different factors, that how are they all relating to photosynthesis. Got it?
Yes, sir.
For example, increasing rate as the number of collision between substrate and enzyme increases. If you see, they're increasing up to the optimum temperature. Here the enzymes denature. The enzymes have just denatured. Hence, when they denature, photosynthesis is no longer able to take place and it drops to zero. Here on the y-axis we have the rate of photosynthesis. X-axis we have temperature. For example, the optimum temperature, if I say, is 50. So beyond 50, the enzymes denature, photosynthesis stops taking place, and the rate of photosynthesis drops down to zero. This is the similar graph to the one for individual enzymes. Of course, photosynthesis depends on enzymes. You'll be studying in A levels that there's an enzyme Rubisco, which is involved in photosynthetic reactions inside the cell in order to make nutrition for the plant. Now we have the second factor, which is light intensity. Of course, light intensity affects photosynthesis. We all know plants trap light energy. The chloroplast or the chlorophyll inside the plant's leaves are responsible for trapping light energy. Of course, when you compare two plants, one is under the sunlight, one is entrapped, one of them is trapped under a dark room. Of course, one is receiving the sunlight, the other one is not receiving any sunlight. Of course, the one receiving the sunlight can carry out photosynthesis. The one in the dark room cannot carry out photosynthesis, as we all know. The intensity of the light available to the plant will affect the amount of energy that it has to carry out for the photosynthesis. For example, higher the light available, higher the energy, higher would be the rate of photosynthesis, and vice versa. Lower the light available, lower would be the energy, lower would be the rate of photosynthesis. Simple. The more light a plant receives, the faster would be the rate of photosynthesis. There's a direct relation. We have light energy directly proportional to the rate of photosynthesis, RP. Light increases, rate of photosynthesis increases. Light decreases, rate of photosynthesis decreases. Simple concept, because we know photosynthesis cannot take place without the presence of sunlight. This trend will continue until some other factor required for photosynthesis prevents the rate from increasing further, because it is now in short supply. Now, this trend will actually continue only when all the other limiting factors are constant. For example, let's read again. This trend will continue until some other factor required for photosynthesis prevents the rate from increasing further. For example, if I am providing the maximum amount of sunlight, there is no shortage of sunlight over here. Okay, I am providing the maximum sunlight to the plant, but the CO2 concentration decreases. Hence, the CO2 concentration being decreased may affect the rate of photosynthesis, even though all the light is present in the environment. The sun is directly above, is providing the maximum sunlight, but if the CO2 concentration decreases inside the environment, in the surroundings, of course, the rate of photosynthesis would be affected. We have the rate of photosynthesis again on the y-axis, light intensity on the x-axis. Plenty of CO2 and warmth, both of them were present. Okay, we had light over here and we had CO2. But at this point, we only had light, but we didn't have any CO2. So that's how you have to relate all these limiting factors and have to keep in mind the graphs. For CO2 concentration, for light intensity, they're basically the same. But for temperature, it's the denaturations of enzyme graph, the optimum temperature graph that we actually studied in biological molecules chapter number 4. For example, we have a graph again, we have rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis, light intensity at x-axis. This is the rate of photosynthesis. At lower light, these are the stages 1, then we have stage 2, and then we have stage 3. At lower light intensities, the increase in the rate is linear. Of course, neither it's a slower rate, neither it's a faster rate. It's a normal, linear, constant increase. But it's constant because we have low light intensities at the moment. Now, the second part, at this point, some other factor becomes limiting. For example, At this point, I had light available. What else is needed? I had CO2 available. These are the needed by the photosynthesis. Now at this point, I had light available, but some other factors such as CO2 was unavailable. Hence, what happens? The graph levels off, the rate becomes constant. So this is how light intensity is actually affecting. Even though I'm having all the light intensity I need for the plant to carry out photosynthesis, but at some point, some other factor becomes limiting, such as CO2 concentration, such as temperature, or anything else. Now we have the third and last factor, which is known as carbon dioxide concentration. As we know, carbon dioxide is required by the photosynthesis. We have CO2 plus water, which forms glucose plus O2. Hence, this availability of CO2 affects the rate of photosynthesis and the number of products or waste products formed. Carbon dioxide is one of the raw materials. This is the raw material required for photosynthesis, topmost priority. This means more carbon dioxide that is present, the faster the reaction can occur. Again, there's a direct relation between the rate of photosynthesis and the concentration of carbon dioxide, which means higher the concentration of carbon dioxide, higher would be the photosynthesis and vice versa. This trend will continue until some other factor required for photosynthesis prevents the rate from increasing further because it is now in short supply. Now, again, we have the same case. Now I have maximum amounts of CO2 present. I have CO2 over here, and I also have light present. At this point, the graph levels of why I still have CO2 present, but some other factor, for example, light intensity, is now not available. Hence, the rate of photosynthesis become constant. Either the temperature or the light intensity needs to be increased to further increase the rate of photosynthesis. If the light energy is being supplied again at this point, the graph would go. If you're supplying maximum amount of CO2, no matter what, you supply all this carbon dioxide you could, but if you are not having light intensity anymore or any other factor, the graph would still remain level off. So at first point, it was the same case for the light intensity also. At the first point and at the second point, the difference was at the first point, I had CO2 and light intensity both. At the second point, I had CO2 but no light intensity, hence the graph levels off. We again have the concentration of carbon dioxide on x-axis and rate of photosynthesis on the y-axis. For example, we again can divide it the first, the second, and the third. So at lower concentrations, the increase rate is linear. Again, neither it's faster nor it's slower. Okay, we have a linear increase, a constant increase in gradient, and at the second point, at this point, some other factor becomes limiting. For example, we have CO2 over here, and we have the optimum temperature also present. For example, now what happened over here in case of carbon dioxide concentration? I still have carbon dioxide concentration because I am supplying it on the x-axis, but the temperature is now no more optimum. Hence, these factors relate with each other. You should know how to link with one another. For example, I could take any other factor over here. For example, I have CO2 available, temperature available, light intensity also available. Now I have CO2 available, I have no optimum temperature, and I have light intensity available. Still, if all three factors are not complete, I had all three factors complete on the first quadrant, but if I don't have all of them complete at the second portion of the graph would not stay linear, it would change direction and it would become zero gradient or the graph levels off. The words you should use in your Edexcel exam. Got it?
Yes, sir.
Now, when we talk about chlorophyll, of course, it's we can say it's a kind of a limiting factor, but of course, if we usually see, we have two types of plants. One of them are having green leaves, one of them might become old, worn out, it must have burned, they have brown leaves. Of course, the green leaves are having more amount of chlorophyll, and the brown leaves, the old leaves, the out of season leaves, which are burned, which are just they have fallen off, they have low amounts of chlorophyll. Hence, the green plants having more amount of chlorophyll will have a higher rate of photosynthesis. The brown plants, the brown leaves, having low amounts of chlorophyll would of course have a lower rate of photosynthesis. Because why? Without chlorophyll, photosynthesis cannot take place because chlorophyll is actually responsible for trapping the light energy from the sun. The number of chloroplasts, as they contain the pigment chlorophyll, which absorbs light energy for photosynthesis, will affect the rate of photosynthesis. Number of chloroplasts would affect the rate of photosynthesis. If there are higher number of chloroplasts, meaning higher amount of chlorophyll, hence faster the rate of photosynthesis. The more chloroplast a plant has, the faster the rate of photosynthesis. The amount of chlorophyll can be affected by diseases. Now, which plants might be affected in such a way that the amount of chlorophyll actually decreases inside those plants? Those plants can either have a disease such as tomato mosaic virus, also known as the TMV virus. We studied it in chapter number 1, if you remember, in the viruses portion. Or this is the first reason. The second reason might be the plant might be lacking nutrients such as magnesium, because I told you once that magnesium is present in chlorophyll. These magnesium ions are actually present inside chlorophyll. Hence, if the plant is lacking of nutrients such as magnesium, it won't be able to produce or synthesize chlorophyll. Hence, no chlorophyll, no photosynthesis. Third reason can be loss of leaves. For example, the autumn season, or if you cut down the plant manually, or if the leaves fall off, lesser the number of leaves, lesser the chloroplast, lesser the amount of chlorophyll, and hence the rate of photosynthesis would also increase. Loss of leaves, fewer leaves means fewer chloroplasts, same meaning that the photosynthesis rate would also decrease.